I want to start by asking you to consider something that most people in the United States and Europe fundamentally misunderstand about China's digital currency project. When Western media discusses the digital yuan, they typically frame it in one of two ways. Either they dismiss it as a surveillance tool that Chinese citizens are reluctant to adopt, or they treat it as a failed attempt to challenge the dollar that has not gained international traction. Both of these framings reveal more about Western assumptions than they do about Chinese strategy. The digital yuan is not primarily about domestic consumer adoption rates. It is not about immediately replacing the dollar in global trade. It is about building financial infrastructure for a world where dollar dominance is no longer guaranteed, and doing so before that world fully arrives. This is patient, strategic positioning executed at national scale over a decade-long horizon. And the fact that Western policymakers and financial institutions largely dismissed it as unimportant for the first several years of development tells you everything you need to know about the difference in strategic thinking. Let me be precise about what we are actually discussing. The digital yuan, officially called the Digital Currency Electronic Payment System, or ECNY, is a central bank digital currency issued and controlled by the People's Bank of China. It is not a cryptocurrency. It is not decentralized. It is a digital version of the renminbi issued directly by the central bank and designed to function as legal tender with full government backing. This matters because the architecture is fundamentally different from both cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and from existing digital payment systems like Alipay or WeChat Pay. Those payment systems are private platforms that sit on top of the banking system. The digital yuan is base money, central bank money, with the same legal status as physical cash. This distinction is critical to understanding both its capabilities and its strategic purpose. China began researching central bank digital currencies in 2014, established a dedicated research institute in 2016, and launched pilot programs in 2020. By 2024, the digital yuan had been tested in hundreds of cities, processed hundreds of billions of yuan in transactions, and been integrated into payment systems used by hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens. The point is not mass adoption yet. The point is infrastructure. China has built the technical systems, the regulatory frameworks, the interbank connectivity, the merchant acceptance networks, and the international payment channels necessary for a central bank digital currency to function at scale. This infrastructure now exists and is operational. Whether people choose to use it heavily right now is secondary to the fact that it can be used, can be scaled, and can be modified based on real-world testing. Now let me explain why this matters in the context of global financial architecture. The current international financial system is built on several layers of infrastructure that give the United States enormous structural power. The dollar is the dominant global reserve currency. Approximately 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Roughly 90% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar on one side. Most international commodities, including oil, are priced and traded in dollars. This creates what economists call the exorbitant privilege. The United States can borrow cheaply in its own currency, run persistent trade deficits without immediate currency crises, and finance government spending in ways other countries cannot. But the dominance extends beyond the currency itself. It extends to the payment infrastructure. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a messaging network that banks use to send payment instructions internationally. It is based in Belgium but operates under significant US and European influence. When you hear about financial sanctions, about countries or institutions being cut off from the international financial system, what that usually means in practice is being cut off from SWIFT. Without access to SWIFT, banks cannot easily send or receive international payments. This gives the United States and its allies enormous coercive power. Iran has been cut off from SWIFT multiple times. Russian banks were cut off after the invasion of Ukraine. The threat of being cut off disciplines behavior even when sanctions are not actively imposed. This is not conspiracy theory. This is simply how the system functions. and American policymakers openly describe financial sanctions as a key tool of statecraft. But here is what China understood early and clearly. A system that gives one country the ability to exclude you from international payments is a system you should not depend on indefinitely, especially as geopolitical competition intensifies. China is the world's largest trading nation, the largest exporter, the second largest economy. It is also in escalating strategic competition with the United States over Taiwan, technology, regional influence, and global order. Depending entirely on dollar-denominated trade and US-controlled payment infrastructure in that context is a strategic vulnerability. So China began building alternatives. This is not one project. This is a coordinated set of initiatives executed across multiple institutions over more than a decade. The digital yuan is one component. The cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, is another. CIPS is China's alternative to SWIFT for renminbi transactions. It launched in 2015 and has been steadily expanding. Bilateral currency swap agreements are another component. China has established swap lines with dozens of countries, allowing trade to be settled in renminbi without converting through dollars. The Belt and Road Initiative includes financial infrastructure components. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank provides an alternative to US-dominated institutions. Each of these initiatives has been dismissed at various times as insignificant by Western analysts. But each is a piece of infrastructure that reduces dependence on dollar-dominated, US-controlled financial systems. The digital yuan fits into this broader architecture in several specific ways. First, it provides a technological foundation for cross-border payments that do not require correspondent banking relationships or SWIFT messaging. Two countries with digital yuan infrastructure can settle transactions directly through central bank digital currency channels. Second, it reduces friction in renminbi internationalization. The digital yuan aims to make renminbi transactions as fast and seamless as dollar transactions, removing a practical barrier to adoption. Third, it gives China's central bank unprecedented visibility into payment flows and the ability to implement monetary policy with precision that is difficult in cash-based systems. Let me be very clear about what this does not mean. This does not mean the digital yuan is about to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. That is not happening in the next 5 years or probably even the next 20. The dollar's position is built on deep, liquid capital markets, rule of law, property rights, and network effects accumulated over decades. China does not yet have fully convertible capital accounts. The renminbi cannot flow freely in and out of China without capital controls. These are real limitations that will not be overcome quickly. Anyone telling you the digital yuan will dethrone the dollar in the near term does not understand international finance, but that is not the goal. The goal is to build infrastructure for a multipolar financial system where the dollar is no longer the only option, where China and its trading partners have alternatives, when those alternatives serve their interests, and where US financial coercion becomes more difficult and costly. Think about this in terms of strategic optionality. Right now, if the United States decides to sanction a Chinese bank or company, that entity loses access to dollar clearing and faces severe consequences. If Chinese trading partners want to avoid secondary sanctions, they must stop doing business with the sanctioned entity. This gives the United States enormous leverage. But if China and its trading partners can settle transactions in digital yuan through CIPS or direct central bank channels, the leverage decreases. Not to zero, because dollars remain essential for many transactions, but it decreases meaningfully. This does not require the digital yuan to become globally dominant. It only requires enough adoption among enough trading partners to create viable alternatives for a meaningful share of transactions. This is infrastructure for strategic independence, not immediate hegemony. Now let me explain what the United States and Western financial systems have done in response. The short answer is very little, very late, and with enormous institutional obstacles. The Federal Reserve began seriously researching central bank digital currencies around 2020, roughly 6 years after China started. The European Central Bank began similar research around the same time. Both institutions have published papers, conducted studies, and run pilot programs. Neither has deployed an operational central bank digital currency. Neither has a clear timeline for deployment. Neither has resolved the fundamental institutional and political questions about what role a CBDC would play in their financial systems. Why the delay and difficulty? Because the United States and European countries face structural barriers that China does not. First, there is the commercial banking lobby. In the United States and Europe, commercial banks are powerful political actors. They do not want central bank digital currencies that might allow citizens to hold accounts directly with the central bank, bypassing commercial banks. This threatens bank deposits, bank funding models, and bank profitability. So banks have lobbied against CBDCs or pushed for designs that preserve bank intermediation. China's banking system is dominated by state-owned banks that operate under party discipline. When the central government decides to implement a CBDC, banks cooperate because they do not have the political autonomy to obstruct. Second, there are genuine concerns about privacy and government surveillance that carry more political weight in democracies. A central bank digital currency gives the issuing central bank visibility into transactions in ways that cash does not. In China, this is treated as a feature. It enables anti-money laundering enforcement, tax collection, and monetary policy implementation. In the United States and Europe, this is treated as a potential threat to civil liberties. These concerns deserve serious consideration, but they also slow development. Every design decision becomes a battleground. China faces no such debate. The government prioritizes state capacity over individual privacy and faces limited domestic political resistance. Third, the United States faces a unique dilemma that China does not. The dollar's global dominance is a source of enormous power, but it also creates path dependence. The current system works extremely well for American interests in many ways. Why risk disrupting it? A central bank digital currency might make certain transactions more efficient, but it might also create new vulnerabilities or accelerate de-dollarization by making alternative currencies more competitive. This creates institutional caution. If you are winning the game, you are hesitant to change the rules. China is not winning the current game. China has clear incentives to build alternatives. The United States has ambiguous incentives. This asymmetry in strategic motivation matters enormously. Fourth, and this is critical, the United States has a fragmented financial regulatory system with overlapping jurisdictions and competing agencies. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, state regulators, Congress, all have some role in financial system governance. Coordinating these actors to implement something as significant as a CBDC requires overcoming massive bureaucratic and political obstacles. China has the People's Bank of China operating under state council authority with party oversight. When a strategic decision is made, implementation is coordinated. Agencies do not compete. This is the same structural advantage China has demonstrated in infrastructure, industrial policy, and technology strategy. Coordinated state capacity versus fragmented pluralism. Let me address the common Western criticisms of the digital yuan directly. The first criticism is that adoption has been slow and Chinese citizens prefer Alipay and WeChat Pay. This is true, but irrelevant to strategic intent. The digital yuan was not designed to replace existing platforms in the short term. Those platforms work well for domestic consumer payments. The digital yuan is about building infrastructure for use cases where those platforms are inadequate. International payments, large-scale transactions, situations where private platform risk is unacceptable, and scenarios where state visibility or control is required. Consumer adoption rates tell us nothing about whether the infrastructure serves its strategic purpose. The second criticism is that the digital yuan is a surveillance tool that violates privacy. This is accurate but incomplete. Yes, the digital yuan gives the Chinese government greater visibility into transactions. But China already has extensive financial surveillance through existing banking systems and payment platforms. What the digital yuan changes is the government's ability to monitor and intervene in transactions with precision and speed. This is intentional. From the perspective of Chinese policymakers, this is a feature that enables state capacity. Western observers may find this objectionable, but projecting Western values onto Chinese policy does not help you understand Chinese strategy. The third criticism is that the digital yuan has not achieved significant international adoption. Again, this misunderstands the timeline. China is not trying to force immediate global adoption. China is building infrastructure and testing use cases. Bilateral digital currency arrangements with Hong Kong, with Thailand, with the UAE, these are experiments. They are learning exercises. When I say China thinks in decades, I mean it literally. The infrastructure is being built now for a world that may emerge in the 2030s or 2040s, a world where dollar dominance has eroded due to US fiscal trajectory, political dysfunction, or geopolitical fragmentation. When that world arrives, if it arrives, China will have operational alternatives. The United States will still be debating whether to build them. There is a deeper pattern here that extends beyond digital currency. China repeatedly demonstrates the ability to identify strategic vulnerabilities, invest in addressing them before they become acute, and maintain focus across political cycles. The United States repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. It identifies problems, debates solutions, faces institutional gridlock, defers action, and then scrambles to respond after the problem becomes a crisis. Think about high-speed rail, think about 5G infrastructure, think about rare earth processing. The pattern is consistent. And in financial infrastructure, the pattern is especially dangerous because finance is built on confidence and network effects. Once systems are established and adopted, they are extraordinarily difficult to displace. Let me give you a concrete scenario to illustrate why this matters. Imagine China and Saudi Arabia decide to settle oil transactions in digital yuan. Not all oil transactions, not immediately, but a meaningful percentage. This is not far-fetched. China is Saudi Arabia's largest customer. Saudi Arabia is diversifying its strategic relationships and hedging against US unpredictability. A digital yuan-denominated oil trade bypasses dollars, bypasses SWIFT, and demonstrates that the world's most important commodity can be traded outside the dollar system. This would not destroy dollar dominance, but it would crack the foundation. Other countries would take notice. Some would begin experimenting with similar arrangements. The network effects that sustain dollar hegemony would begin to erode. And this erosion would accelerate if the United States responded with sanctions or threats, because that would validate the decision to build alternatives. The Belt and Road Initiative provides additional context. As China finances infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, it is simultaneously building the financial relationships and institutional connections that could facilitate digital yuan adoption. Countries that borrow from China, that trade extensively with China, that receive Chinese infrastructure investment, these countries have natural incentives to adopt Chinese payment systems and reduce dollar dependence. This is not coercion. This is strategic coordination. Financial infrastructure and physical infrastructure are being built together, creating integrated systems that work better within Chinese networks than outside them. The United States built something similar after World War II through the Marshall Plan and Bretton Woods. China is building the 21st century version, adapted to digital technology and a multipolar world. I want to emphasize something that often gets lost. None of this requires you to believe China has a superior political system or that Chinese authoritarianism is desirable. You can believe deeply in democracy, rule of law, and human rights, while still recognizing that China's political system provides certain advantages in executing long-term infrastructure strategy. Authoritarian coordination enables patient capital deployment and sustained focus in ways that electoral democracies struggle to match. This is not an endorsement, this is an observation about institutional capabilities, and it is an observation that should worry people who care about sustaining democratic systems. Because if authoritarian coordination consistently outperforms democratic fragmentation in strategic infrastructure, the long-term implications are deeply concerning. The United States is not helpless. It retains enormous advantages. It has the deepest capital markets in the world. It has the most trusted legal system for property rights and contract enforcement. It has reserve currency status that will not disappear quickly. It has powerful technology companies and innovative financial institutions. But these advantages are not permanent. They were built over decades and they can erode over decades. The current trajectory is concerning. US government debt continues to climb. Political dysfunction continues to worsen. Infrastructure continues to age. International partners continue to hedge their strategic commitments. Every one of these trends makes alternatives to dollar dominance more attractive and more viable. And China is building those alternatives methodically and patiently. What should concern strategic thinkers is not that China will suddenly overtake the dollar next year. It is that the United States is sleepwalking into a world where its financial dominance can no longer be assumed, where alternatives exist and function, and where the costs of US policy mistakes are dramatically higher because exit options are available. This world does not require Chinese hegemony. It only requires sufficient alternatives that dollar dominance becomes conditional rather than structural. And we are moving toward that world whether American policymakers acknowledge it or not. The digital yuan is infrastructure for that world. It is not sufficient by itself. It requires complementary developments in payment systems, currency swaps, trade financing, and geopolitical alignment. But it is a necessary component, and it is operational now while US equivalents remain theoretical. This gap will have consequences. Not immediately, not dramatically, but cumulatively over years and decades. By the time the consequences become undeniable, the infrastructure gap will be even larger and more difficult to close. What should concern you most is not any single initiative. It is the pattern of patient, coordinated, multi-decade infrastructure building while the United States debates, delays, and defers. China identified financial infrastructure as strategic in the early 2010s and began building. The United States is still conducting studies. China launched digital yuan pilots in 2020 and has processed hundreds of billions in transactions. The United States is still debating design principles. China has established CIPS, expanded currency swaps, and integrated digital payments into Belt and Road projects. The United States is still explaining why the current system works fine. This asymmetry in urgency and execution will compound. And compounding asymmetries create structural shifts that are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. I want to close with clear-eyed realism about what this means. The dollar will remain dominant for the foreseeable future. China is not attempting sudden displacement, but dominance is not binary. It is a spectrum. And that spectrum is shifting slowly but measurably away from absolute dollar hegemony toward a more multipolar financial architecture where alternatives exist and function. The digital yuan is one component of that shift. It represents patient infrastructure building for a world that has not fully arrived, but that China believes is coming. Whether that world arrives depends on many factors, many outside China's control. But when it arrives, if it arrives, China will be prepared. The United States will not. And that difference in preparation is the difference between adaptation and crisis. The question is not whether the United States can maintain financial dominance forever. Nothing lasts forever. The question is whether the United States can manage the transition from hegemony to something more contested without catastrophic disruption. And right now, the evidence suggests the United States is not preparing for that transition. It is pretending the transition is not happening. That is the most dangerous strategy of all.